if everyone's all right, then I think we'll get moving. Hi, my name's Ian Anderson, and President of TSA. On behalf of all my colleagues at TSA, I'm really delighted to have you on this webinar. We've been really pleased to host a number of these through the quarantine period, and thank you everyone for the really splendid feedback we've been getting from everyone. So count on us for more of these as we go forward. Also want to just point out that we will have something else new to send you very shortly, a new graphic identity and website that we've been working on through the quarantine period that I think will kind of lead us into a more of a 2020 graphic identity as well. So we'll look forward to sharing that with you very soon. And with that, I'm going to pass you over to my colleague, Scott Munnick, to introduce our old friend and very special guest.
Well, thanks, Ian, and welcome everybody. And if Christmas comes early, I'm going to be all set this year. So that's what I've been doing in the quarantine. Our agenda today is very straightforward, and we'll be focused on a presentation by our good friend, Greg Lyle from Innovative Research Group. I've known Greg for probably 30 years when we were both working in the political world. I was in Ottawa in the Prime Minister's office, and Greg was with the Premier of Manitoba, and our paths crossed many, many times. After that, Greg found out observing and participating in the public opinion space from assorted viewpoints, all the while observing and learning the sector. He founded his own company in 2004, and in my opinion, he's really established himself as a preeminent analyst of the public opinion and behavior. And Greg and I have done this presentation or been part of presentations together many times over the years. And I've always valued his opinion and his analysis of what happened, why it happened, and what it all means. So jump forward to 2020 and the COVID-19 virus, and I can't think of a better person to give us an update on what to expect and where things are moving, or where things are going and moving forward. Canada now is probably in the middle position, if you like, in dealing with the virus. We're generally cautious. We've been pretty deliberate, I think, in our actions at both the federal and the provincial levels, and I think things have generally moved forward pretty well. South of the border, on the other hand, I'm listening to the numbers earlier today. Florida's out of control, Texas, Arizona, California, all have problems that unfortunately could affect us down the road, but that's for another day. So I'll leave Greg to tell us what it all means and where we all go. As for the format moving forward, I'll hand it over to my colleague, Ryan Singh, who will let you know how you can participate in terms of questions, and then he'll bring Greg into the picture and we'll go from there. Ryan, over to you.
Great, thanks, Scott. Welcome, everybody, and I'm looking forward to today's presentation. Just so you know, part of the presentation, part of today, is allowing you to ask questions. So Greg will have a pretty extensive presentation, and when I had an opportunity to review the presentation prior to this, I was amazed at some of the numbers and some of the data he's been able to collect and the response out there. But with that, we want you to ask questions. So you can click on the icon, the Q&A icon right at the bottom of your screen. You can submit questions. They'll come live to me. When we get to that portion of today's webinar, I will open up the floor and read those questions out. Alternatively, you could email your questions to info@tsa.ca. We'll also do our best to get your questions to Greg right after his presentation. So with that, I'll invite our guest speaker. I know most people who are signed on today are here to hear from him and not hear from me. So Greg, welcome to TSA webinar. And I know we're gonna switch screens so we can see some of that fascinating data that you have ready for us.
Excellent. Oh, and there we go. Well, thank you, everyone. This should be fun going through this, and I'm looking forward to your questions. I'm going to cover off three major topics today. I'm going to look at what the new normal looks like in terms of how people are behaving. I'm going to talk briefly about the impact of COVID response on sector reputation, so you can think about it in terms of your own organizations. And then we're going to move on to government, and I'm going to look at both sort of what the implications have been to date and what expectations are for the future. when we do this, we're using a series of online polls that we've done. We've done 9 waves of surveys now on COVID-19. The latest survey just came out of field 2 days ago, so very fresh data. The sort of base sample we use is 1,200, and the way that we build that sample, because these things matter, is that we set age and gender quotas by sub-regions of larger provinces. So we do 4 regions in Ontario, we do 3 regions in Alberta, we do 3 regions in BC, so that we don't end up getting all Winnipeggers for Manitoba, for example. So we feel pretty confident in the numbers you're seeing here, even though they're online, which means you can't apply margins of error. It's still representative. So what are Canadians expecting? When they look ahead and they think about COVID, do they think it's all over now, or do they think there's more to come? And what you can see is that the largest group of people believe that there's going to be outbreaks continuing for the foreseeable future. And that has all sorts of implications as we go forward for changes in behavior. It also means, and I think most of the people on this call will understand it, that we're basically in a 90% economy for the foreseeable future. There's not going to be international tourism. There are certain types of businesses like the convention business, the professional sports business, the music business that are just not going to be a part of our economy for some period of time to come. When we look at how people behave as a result of that, right now we find that we've gone from 57% of the workforce saying that they go to school or work every day to 43%, with a big shift moving to the people that say that they're working from home. The ones that are working from home every day have gone from 15% to 35%. And we're curious, how likely is it that they'll be asked to go back to work, and how concerned they are about that? And when we look at how concerned people were, we found 66% say that they're at least somewhat concerned about the risk of catching COVID if they have to go back to work. Now, the good news is that we have a phrase that passion equals action, that if you don't see real intense concern, you have a manageable issue. Only 24% say that they're very concerned. That's still 1 in 4. That's not a small number of people, but 3 out of 4 are not in that category. So a lot, and it's not that people aren't afraid of COVID, but they feel that either they know what they need to do to protect themselves, or that public measures are being taken that will protect them. When we probe deeper to say, what is it that you're worried about that would cause risk? It's close contact with others, the inability to maintain social distance. That is far and above the #1 issue. And so when you think about your own staff, your own teams, and if you're trying to manage a return to the workplace with them, the #1 thing you need to do is explain how they are going to be protected in terms of contact with others and social distancing, and what precautions you'll take to make sure that everyone that comes into that workplace takes the precautions seriously and does what's necessary to protect others. The good news in this is that we were concerned that we might hear comments about commuting, and which is out of our control. It's not our workplace, it's getting to the workplace. And you can see there's some mentions of public transit, but when we looked at the verbatims, it was more about being in the workplace than getting to the workplace. And other research we've done has shown well over 60% feel that their process of getting to work is very safe. So that doesn't look like a general weak link. It will be an issue for some, but not for most people. One thing that was really interesting for us, so I used to do this, used to ask about major purchases a lot back in the days when we had regular recessions. But as we all know, there hasn't been a downturn for a decade. And so we were getting the same number all the time and stopped following that. but I'm going to be able to show you what things look like in a regular time compared to now. So the first thing that's interesting is a number of people that have said that they've delayed a major purchase. And these numbers, which look relatively small, 17% saying that they've made, that they would delay purchases on making renovations to their home, or purchasing a TV stereo at 14, purchasing a car or vehicle at 14. They look relatively low as a share of the population, but they're very high compared to the normal incidence of making a major purchase. So it does look like the demand side of the economy did a lot of punting to the future. But when we look at what their plans are, the top bar for each of these pairs is the data from last weekend. The bottom one is from a typical up period of the economy, February 2016. And you can see that pretty much for everything, we see more intentions to make a major purchase than we saw in a sort of typical up month before COVID-19. So that suggests that from the demand side, what we have is that we don't have destruction of demand, we have rescheduling of demand. And that bodes very well, even though we can't fix the part of the economies that can't reopen. This does suggest that we may get a little bit of a catch-up to help offset the slowdown that we had at the beginning of the year. So how are people going to do this shopping if they are going to buy more? How do they intend to do it? When we look at how people do their shopping, you can see that before the pandemic, there was only 9% that did most or all of their shopping online. Today, that's 26%. Before, we had 70% saying they did all or most of their shopping from stores. That's still relatively high at 47%, but down 20 points from where it was. We asked people how likely do they think it is that they'll return to their old habits. And what you can see is that only 24% tell us they expect to go back to the same level of in-person shopping that they did before. So clearly the shift to an online world is going to be with us for a while, to at least some degree. One thing that I was sort of interested in is to what degree is this driven by fear? And it is somewhat related to fear of COVID. It's not a general anxiety issue. But when you look at COVID and you look at the number of people that say they're returning to the old pattern, 34% of those that have a very low level of concern about COVID are planning to return to their old pattern. Only 19% of the people with the highest levels. But still, that still means 66% of the ones with the lowest level of COVID concerns are still planning to do more of their shopping online than they used to. So this is a real thing. If you're in the brick and mortar business, if you have a storefront, you're not going to get the traffic that you had before. And if you don't have an online presence to make up for that, you're going to be in a constrained situation. And when we take a look at where the patterns of shopping is, the people that were all in person in the first place, they're really hoping to go back. Half of them are hoping to go back. There's much less. Anyone that had even a little bit of online shopping before COVID is planning to continue to do an increased amount of their shopping online. When we look at online banking, it's sort of more interesting. What I was sort of surprised at is the number of people that do online banking that said they did it almost in person before the lockdown, such as it was. 13% did all or most of their banking in person. It only dropped by 4 points during the lockdown. It seems like the brick and mortar banking people are really committed to staying with that persona, staying with that behavior. But clearly there was a shift, and you can see a 11-point increase in the number that say that they did all their banking online now compared to where we were pre-COVID. There's been a shift, and when we look at where that shift is, you can see that there's relatively few people that are planning to go back to their old pattern, only 20%. Most people expect to do more of their banking online. So again, the people that were sort of most committed to in-person banking before are still doing that, but the people that had any degree of online banking are now more likely to do it than they were before. So again, less demand for brick and mortar support. And again, you can see it's the people that were all in person that are most likely to go back to the pattern of all in person. But it did break loose. Those people that were willing to make a change, and we saw about 4% were had reported doing less in-person banking now than before. So it's a relatively small group of people, but they're certainly open more than the all in-person shopping people to keeping their new behavior to some degree anyhow. Now, social activity, it gets more dramatic. So if you take a look at social activity, the number that say they went to restaurants, 70% at least once a month, 45% saying they expect to go to restaurants at least once a month this summer. You can see a major drop in intensity. The several times a week or at least once a week was 40% before COVID. It's only expected to be 20%. So that's a big drop in traffic. Even if you had the space, even if there weren't restrictions in how many people you could squeeze in, there's going to be fewer people showing up in the door. So that's not good news for a part of the economy that's already been pretty seriously stressed. And when we look at this behavior by usage segment, you can see the drop-off is pretty consistent across all the categories, but it's most severe among the people that went the most. So again, in terms of actual trips to a restaurant, given the people that did the most trips are least likely to say they're going to go back to their old behavior. This means that the likely decline is going to be even greater in terms of actual cash flow than you would expect just from that first chart. When we look at movies, again, I'm actually not sure. Again, we're asking people sort of, did they go out before, and then how often did they expect to go when it's reopened? It was 21% saying at least once a month, 13% expect to go at least once a month in the summer. Interesting, the hardcore, the 1 in 25 that said that they were going at least once a week, most of them plan to go back. It was a part of their lifestyle. There are obviously younger people as well who are less concerned about getting COVID themselves. But still a fairly significant decline in likely behavior. Again, when you take a look here, you can see that only a little over a third of the people that go the most often are likely to go back to their previous behavior. And so that suggests that the likely decline, which was already scary on just the top line charts, looks a bit more scary when you look at it sort of skewing towards the most frequent moviegoers. And then the last bit of behavior I want to look at is flying. And I'll just let you know that I'm someone that probably did 100 flights a year pre-COVID and haven't been on a plane. Tomorrow's my first time on a plane in 4 months. And so we looked at how often people, as it happened, this is something that we've looked at in the past, and we're pretty comfortable in these numbers. It looks consistent with other research we've done. So 17% of the public claimed that they were flying 3 or more times a year before COVID. Only 5% expect to be flying 3 or more times a year in the future. When we ask people when the restrictions are lifted, do you think you're going to go back to your old patterns or not? Only 21% are confident they're going to go back to their old patterns. So, you know, when you saw the news yesterday in terms of WestJet doing a permanent layoff, you can understand why. There's just clearly not going to be any time in the future anywhere near as many people flying as there were in the past. When we take a look at this again, one of the scary things here is that the people that were the most frequent flyers are the ones most likely to say they are not returning to their previous pattern. Only 16% expect to fly as much as they used to. 60% say that they will fly more than they are currently, but not at the old level. And then you've got almost a quarter saying that they're going to be at the current levels, or they're just not sure. So it's the most dramatic fall off we've seen of any of the behaviors that we looked at. Clearly, the airlines are smart in making adjustments to recognize that future. So I want to talk a bit about the impact of COVID on reputation. And what we did is that we asked people, we gave them a list of 26, I think, different sectors, some of which are business sectors, but some of which are sort of public service sectors, and asked whether they thought each of the sectors has done a good or a bad job responding to the challenges of the COVID-19 crisis. And so you can see there's three groups in particular, three sectors that are seen as doing remarkably well. They've really built brand out of their response to this event, and that's grocery, pharmacy, and hospitals. These are people that were on the front lines, delivering essential services, had to reorganize how they were doing things at the drop of a hat, and keep themselves and their customers safe, and they were seen as successful in doing that. Then most other sectors that we tested, you can see restaurants, commercial transport, electrical utilities, streaming service providers, independent retailers, internet service providers, big box stores, universities, nurseries and gardening stores, farms and ranches, and I've got more on the next page we'll come to shortly. They basically were seen as doing a good job of responding. They just weren't seen as making quite the heroic efforts. Restaurants are definitely seen as the most sympathetic of the rest of that group. But commercial transport, there was a lot of talk, a lot of stories in the early days about the challenge of just finding a bathroom when you're driving supplies, a lot of attention to the supply chain, and a lot of people were impressed by what they saw. So being impressed, again, banks, K-12 schools, college and SAGET, manufacturing, construction, public transit, cell mobility providers, all those organizations, all those sectors, much more positive than negative in terms of the impact on their reputation. Then we get three: airlines, residential landlords, and insurance, where they're not quite negative, but they're getting there. And the common thread between those three is that it's all got something to do with disputes over money. So that insurance, auto insurance companies give the discounts people were expecting. Did airlines refund their tickets? Did landlords give people a break on rent? And there's been controversy on all three of those files, and so there's been more negative for them, but not overall negative, but still more negative than most of the other ones. And then the three that we included, which were involved with outbreaks and deaths, are the three where that lost reputation: meat packing plants, retirement homes, and nursing and long-term care homes. And we wanted to try and see if there was a distinction between retirement homes that have a low level of care and nursing and long-term care homes that have a more significant level of care. And there is a little bit of a difference, but it's a nuanced difference. They're generally seen as being in the same family. I think I've given Temple Scott a copy that's as a PDF, and they're welcome to share it so people can go through this at their own leisure later on. But we have just a way of analyzing this in terms of seeing whether there's a reputation at risk, whether there's an opportunity to build reputation, or whether reputations are being destroyed or built. And what we've done is that we take that single question, we break it into two dimensions. One is, do people have an opinion at all? So where there's a lot of people that say don't know or uncertain, that pushes people towards the bottom end of this chart. When everyone's got an opinion, they go towards the top of the chart. And so you get, and then on the x-axis, the one going along the horizontal plane, we've got whether it's a positive or negative impact on reputation just by subtracting the negative impact from the positive. And when you take a look at that, what you can see is the three that are suffering damage right now, three that are at risk, and then the rest that are building reputation to some degree. And that sort of gives you a sense of whether you're a sector at risk or whether you're a sector in good position. So I'm going to move on to government. We're covering a lot of territory here, but we're more than halfway through, so we should have time for some questions. So government approval on COVID's been high. I think everyone's aware of that. These sort of numbers, where you see 70% approval for the average province and 61% for the federal government, are well above what you normally see. A really popular government would get a 50% approval. These numbers are unusually high, and they've been steady all the way along. There's no major sign of a decline yet. When we take a look at the scene provincially, I've included just the 4 biggest provinces here because we have good samples every month. You can see that Quebec started out very strong compared to the other provinces, basically because they were in a fight with the feds over the borders. They lost ground with the outbreaks that occurred in the seniors' homes, but they've basically been able to stay competitive with the other provinces. BC, which has taken a very different approach. The premier in BC, for those that aren't in BC, is hardly ever on TV. He goes on TV maybe once a week, depending on whether he has something to say or not. He leaves the day-to-day work to his Minister of Health and to the Chief Medical Officer, and the Chief Medical Officer is really the star. The Minister of Health is a supporting actor. And even though they basically made Bonnie Henry the star, they have benefited. And overall, or the approval of the province on handling is now the highest in the country at 83%. Alberta stumbled with the meatpacking plants and with the disputes with the doctors, and at one point was dropping, but they picked up their paces since April, and they're now within reach of the other provinces. At 60% approval, doesn't look that high compared to everyone else, but it's much higher than a typical province on any other issue at any other time. So it's not a bad number, it's just not as great as the others. So there's been a bunch of important political implications from this, even though, there's no elections in the offing for any of these people. So the first thing to understand is that the positive response that governments are getting to COVID is pulling up their overall approval for everybody everywhere. The weakness of that is Alberta, but Alberta's up 9 points in approval, from 40% to 49% over the course of the pandemic. The feds are up from 44 to 58, and it keeps going all across the board. The most dramatic improvement is Ontario, which was at 37% approval before COVID hit, and is now at 65% in overall approval, not in COVID approval, overall approval. So there's now 2 out of 3 people in Ontario that support the job the government of Doug Ford is doing, and those are words I would never have expected to say in February. So it's really a remarkable turnaround. When we look federally, it's paying off in votes. So I think people have seen this coverage in the media. It's not a big surprise to you in this presentation. The one thing I would just focus on is we ask every month in our tracking, we ask, what have you read, seen, heard, or have you read, seen, heard anything about the federal government? What was it? And does it leave you more or less favorable towards them? And this is going back to 2012, so you get a sense of what the typical behavior is. You can see that at 31% saying that they have a somewhat less favorable impression of the federal government as of last weekend, we're now starting to see unfavorable mentions grow, and the positive mentions are dropping quite dramatically. And we now have sort of almost an equal balance of negative and positive mentions. And when you look at the issues, what you see is things other than COVID are starting to pull them back. So Trudeau losing the bid for the UN Security Council's seat. This is not our list. This is what the public tells us they've heard. So 26% of the public have heard something about the UN fight, and that's leaving people only 6% more favorable towards the government and 45% less favorable. 2 Canadians jailed in China, the 2 Michaels. That has got people 39% less favorable, 20% more favorable, so a negative 19. And then general concern about the rising deficit. This is not a broad concern, but there's a 9% of the population raise it as something that they've heard, and the impact is overwhelmingly negative, 78% less favorable. So you can start to see feet of clay reemerging in the federal government. This is sort of a flashing orange to them, that they may be getting to the end of the rally honeymoon. When we look at what's going on across the country, just looking at the big provinces, the dramatic improvement in Horgan's favorables, which is again really remarkable because he has taken a very different approach than most of the other premiers. He has deliberately gone to the back seat and let the experts take the front seat, and he's been strongly rewarded for that. He's far more popular than the Liberal leader, and far more likely to be chosen as best to be premier. This alone would be enough, if everything else was the same as the last election, to give the NDP a fairly decent majority government, if it holds. But we've deliberately gone with things like best premier, or some of the other measures will be net favorables, because those are underlying brand measures, as opposed to, what do you think of the job they're doing in COVID, which can change on a dime. If we look at what's going on in Alberta, what we see is that even though it's not a dramatic increase like other places, Kenny is a little bit more favorable now than he was going into this. First time he's been positive since he's been premier. And generally what you see in Alberta is that there's just such a strong UCP base that it's really hard to imagine a world in which the NDP are competitive to win in the next election. It's not that they're completely out of the race, but it's just hard to see that change. And COVID has not left Kenny worse off. He's actually better off. When we take a look at what's going in Ontario, again, we see this very dramatic change in Doug Ford's numbers. So when Doug Ford was elected, he had a sort of in the range of a -30 reputation, 30% more people unfavorable impression rather than favorable. So when he got elected, it wasn't to love him by any means. He was sort of just better than the other people. He's now got a +18, and that is remarkable. That is not something that you would have predicted. And that, again, so the issue in Ontario is that there's just more Liberals than Tories in Ontario. So all else being equal, the Liberals ought to win. But that being said, there's an opportunity for Ford to sort of reprise the 1999 election. And for those that don't recall, in 1999, Mike Harris ran on a platform of who's best for the job. And he defined Dalton McGuinty as not ready for the job. Del Duca was part of the Win McGuinty era. He was a minister. And so he's got blood on his hands for some of the scandals that were involved in those days. The opportunity for Ford to make this a job application election and to do better than he might otherwise expect to do is now a real option for him, where it would have been hard to imagine how they could get reelected before COVID. And if we take a look at Quebec, the numbers for the Go are just stunning. He's a +41 in his favorables. He got there quick and he stayed there during the COVID event. And again, the challenge in Quebec is that the government, the CAQ, has very limited brand strength. So there's still a lot of people to vote for the CAQ that are Quebec Liberals or former PQ supporters that still feel loyal to those old parties, even though they're voting for the CAQ. And so having Legault so strong allows him again to run a very personal campaign in the next election and to turn that into votes. Even if his favorables erode somewhat between now and then, he's got a lot of wiggle room here when you compare him to his opponents. So just a couple final slides. So looking ahead in terms of government, in terms of the pace of reopening, There is some nervousness. People are more nervous about going too fast than they are about going too slow, but most people, half the public, feels that the government has, both federally and provincially, has found the right pace in terms of reopening. Now, that's not quite the same all across the country. And so what you see is in BC, with their very strong numbers, they're in good shape. In the Atlantic, with their very strong numbers, they're in good shape. But between the two coasts, there's a lot more concern about the pace of opening, including in Alberta, Quebec, and Ontario. So there is a risk that governments will be seen as going too fast rather than going too slow. There's been a lot of comments about is people's patience running out? It's not. People are okay with the pace that the governments are following, and they're nervous that they might speed up too much. When we take a look at future issues, we came up with a list of 12 items. 6 of them are healthcare priorities, and 6 of them are other priorities. Private sector investment and job creation, getting K-12 back to normal, beginning to reduce the amount of extra spending on COVID-19 measures. And when you take a look at that, you can see any health measure, anything at all about health, is seen as more urgent, more important than any other priority. And this goes back to that slide I showed you up front. Most people think there's at least another wave coming, maybe many waves. And so they're not focused on how do we get the economy to recover. They're focused on how do we make sure that the next wave doesn't flatten us. And so the number one issue there is long-term care. That's been a horrible event for us as a country. Seeing so many of our seniors die as a result of COVID in these facilities. And it's an urgent priority in the minds of Canadians that we take measures to make sure that we protect those people. But there are others that are almost as important. So managing COVID-19 transmission from international travelers coming to Canada, again, a really big issue, something that the government was wrong-footed on earlier in the COVID outbreak, and it'll be very important to the federal government that they be seen to get this right and that they do get this right. Our ability to manufacture our own PPE is the third most pressing priority, and the rest you can see for yourself. But the bottom line here is anything at all to do with health beats anything else, period. We are not in a recovery mindset. We are in a pandemic mindset. We are just in a low ebb of the pandemic. And again, when we look at those in terms of priorities and strengths, when we look at the federal government, you can see nothing is seen as a weakness. This rally has got everything in a positive area in terms of the approval that people are giving to the federal government for the job it's doing on every one of those priorities. They are seen as, if there's anything that's weak, there's some weakness here in terms of making changes to long-term care. There's some weakness here in terms of things like reducing government spending. And there's some weakness here in terms of catch-up. But those are relative weaknesses. They're not actual weaknesses. To be actual weaknesses, they'd have to be on that left-hand side of the screen, and there's nothing there. When we look at the average results for the provinces, we see the same story. Everything is a positive to some degree. The greatest vulnerability is making changes to long-term care. Now, I will highlight that in Ontario, making changes to long-term care is actually just in the critical weakness territory. So it's a more pressing problem in Ontario for that government than it is for any other government in Canada. So to wrap it up, for most Canadians, COVID's not over, far from over. They expect at least one more wave, and many expect more. Given what we normally expect to see, a significant number are reporting that they've delayed major purchases. But also, given what we normally expect to see, planned purchases are higher than expected. So it does look like Canadians are going to do their best to help get the demand side of the economy back up. There is a lot of resistance in returning to normal. 2/3 are concerned about returning to work to some degree. But we know what their concern is. It's all about being able to keep the 6 meters or the 2 meter distance, being able to keep that physical distance, and setting up the office so that they can do that, or the workplace so they can do that, addresses the concern. We also see that there's not going to be as many people going back to the stores, to restaurants, to movies, and a lot less expecting to fly. COVID's having an impact on sector reputation. There's a lot at stake right now. The way people respond, the way they are seen to respond, is making and breaking reputations as we speak. And everyone needs to be thinking about that in terms of their companies and in terms of their sectors. And it is worth noting that you may be the safest long-term care facility in the province, but if you are a long-term care facility, people think you're a dangerous place. And so it's not just about the company, it's not just about the organization, it's about the sector to which you belong. And then the last point here is that there's a strong rally in place. It's created real political benefits that are likely to last beyond the pandemic itself. But the continued pressure on government is not on the economy, not on other measures. The priority for government is very clearly healthcare. So if you're looking for government to do something for you, and you can show a way in which it advances them on any of their priorities, then that's the way to go. With that, I'm going to open it up to questions, so we get a good, hopefully, 18 minutes of questions in.
Great, thank you so much. I know I'm blown away at seeing all of that information in that presentation, Greg, but a lot of the people who are watching here today, they probably have that same sentiment. So I just want to remind everyone, you can click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can submit your questions to Greg. I will read them out, or you can email your questions. You can send it to info@tsa.ca. In one moment, I'll bring that up on the screen. In the meantime, I mean, Greg, I think you said it best, and I think sometimes we don't realize it, that you said we are still in a pandemic mindset. We're not yet in a recovery mindset. I mean, we see a lot in the news, and there's this demand for reopening, and we see people on beaches, and the patios are full to at least what they're able to. But do you feel that there's a sort of silent majority out there that are very quietly still extremely reserved and very, very nervous about what's still going on, but potentially what we might actually see in the future?
Yeah, I mean, there's absolutely no doubt about it. So we still see, there's a lot of data, behavioral data, that showed even before governments were announcing lockdowns, people were acting like they were locked down. And we track a number of things in terms of daily behavior. We still see people behaving like there's a lockdown. They're just not going out as much as they used to. They're not doing as many social contacts. There is some scary stuff going on. So one of the things that we tracked was with the travelers coming back to Canada, it was very important for them to actually isolate, to stay in their homes, get food brought to them, get it delivered. But in actual fact, most of the travelers had some social contact when they got home. They were shopping, they were seeing friends. There were very few, maybe 1 in 5, 1 in 4, that actually went into real isolation when they got home. And we also found that the people that were, even when we were at our highest level of lockdown, the people that were most likely to go out were least likely to take precautions. And so when the second and potentially more waves come, there are some issues in the way that we behave as a society, not on average, but in particular groups that continue to create risk. And we're going to need to think as a community and as governments, how are we going to manage that? Because we're not going to change people. We know how they behave. We now have a dry run. We saw it. We got lucky to a degree. I'm not saying that there weren't a lot of good things done, but you know, a couple more super spreaders and we might have been talking about a different story. So, you know, I'm looking forward to hearing how governments are planning to deal with that.
Excellent. And one of your slides sort of at the top of the presentation elaborated that people don't have fears yet about elevators and public transit as much as sitting in an office.
Right.
Do you simply think that that will shift and you'll see those fears grow as people? So I haven't returned. I think I'm on 102 days out of the office. So my fear about using public transit and using elevators hasn't resonated yet. But do you think as the economy continues to reopen, that we'll see a shift in those fears being out in public transit, using taxis, even using elevators?
Well, we're going to have to see is the bottom line there. What we know is that most people so there is not a panic about COVID-19. People think that COVID-19 is a scary thing, but they're not that scared about catching it themselves. And the reason for that is that combination of believing that governments are doing the right thing and believing that they themselves are doing the right thing. And so people have been able to cope and they've found strategies around things. But, you know, when you think about going up an elevator to the 50th floor of an office building, that is obviously a risk that's going to have to be managed, and it's going to be something that makes people nervous, right? Because the whole issue is that viral load. How, you know, it's not just a matter of being in close contact, but for how long, with what protections. So if there's only 3 of us in the elevator, we're all sort of looking away from each other, we're all wearing masks, and the elevator trip is quick, the real risk is actually probably relatively limited, and people will likely come to understand that as time goes on. The other thing that we know about people is that we often think things we don't do ourselves are risky. Once we start to do them and we become more comfortable with them, we reduce our perception of risk. So it could be that many people will feel going in elevators are risky, but those that do it all the time will not feel that they're risky because they feel appropriate measures are being taken. The same thing may or may not be true for transit, right? So there's an open question of how do you manage the behavior of transit users, right? Like think about taking a streetcar down down Spadina, right? There's only one person on that streetcar and they're driving it. So, you know, in terms of staff, so how is TTC going to make sure that we don't have a problem of unmasked people crowding other unmasked people? We just don't know. All we know, though, is that, you know, worldwide, there's been relatively few examples of a major outbreak caused because of transit. So somehow that's been managed. Anyhow, the bottom line here is that people are nervous about all those things. That's why they don't want government to rush opening the door, and why they do want government to rush getting ready for the next breakout, because they know what's coming. They just don't know how.
So sort of, I guess, it's along the lines of human behavior and a little bit about sort of anticipating what to expect. The question came in, do you feel that where food is sourced will become more of an issue? Government talks about food security for Canadians, but this term has not yet been clearly defined. And I guess what we see with a lot of migrant workers coming and picking vegetables and crops, even in Ontario, but in general, where food comes from around the world to Canada, vice versa. Do you think food security is going to become more of a prominent issue that emerges because of this?
Well, I think supply chains generally become, first of all, supply chain is now a word, right? So for everyone on this call, it's been a word for a long time. For the average person, it's not the sort of thing that they spend much time thinking about. It was a big discussion point during this outbreak. So I think supply chains generally are going to be an opportunity and a challenge. I think the opportunity to be intel inside, right? So to be locally sourced is important. We saw with the PPE that the issue of being dependent on overseas supply was a great concern. And I talked before about how grocery and pharmacy were also businesses that we're seeing as being very heroic in the process. And so the idea is saying, just like we need to make sure we have made in Canada PPE for our frontline providers, we also need other types of essential goods like food to be sourced more from Canada than from overseas. Now, here's the rub though. Will people pay for it? Right? And so that's a huge issue here. There's sort of three types of problems in the economy right now in terms of business. One is the businesses that are shut down still. The second is the businesses that have had their cost structures impacted. Restaurants are a really good example. There's more overhead now per customer. That over time should result in an increase in price. And there are a lot of other situations like that where it's going to cost more to deliver the same service. Generally, the reason why we have overseas food production is to save money. So the question is, how much more will people be willing to pay? Now, I think the world is probably more open to codes and standards type solutions to these things. So if the government food policy has the effect of driving up cost, but it's not something that you directly see, people may be more willing to live with it than if you say you can pay 10 cents more to get this tomato from your local farmer than get it from Chile.
Okay, so we got a few more questions, and I know we're getting close to the top of the hour. One person here asked, have more people been more politically engaged or engaged with government during this period? And do you think that will actually change? So, I can attest to, I'm home and I work in politics and government and I watch all of those news conferences, but a lot of my friends who typically don't observe politics, they're at home and they're doing very similarly the same sort of thing. Do you expect that trend? Is it even a trend, or is it something?
So there's a lot more attention being given to politics right now, a lot more. But that is already declining, right? So the first month or so, it seemed like everyone watched every news conference that was going to find out the latest information. And there's a simple psychology before that, right? We were personally afraid of getting this thing, right? And so, what drives our information search, first and foremost, is the search for safety. And so it wasn't about politics, it was about personal safety. But that being said, all of a sudden politics is way more relevant for people. And so all else being considered, my expectation would be if there were an election tomorrow, the turnout would be up because a lot fewer people will need it explained to them why politics matters when they've seen politics mattering in their daily lives every day for months. In new and novel ways. It's always, for those of us that have been in politics, we see political implications every day in the world that we live in. But the average person, because it's not new and different, they just take those things for granted. They don't realize it. Anyhow, so the answer is I think there's certainly been more consumption of political information. Another thing that's really important is that we see there's been a major decline in populism. And so when we ask people to choose between whether government should rely on experts because politics is complicated or whether they should give primacy to the common sense of the average person, there's been more saying common sense over experts than say experts first since 1990. This goes back to the rise of the Reform Party. For the first time in 30 years, that switched. And there are now more people that say we should defer to experts. So that's a lot more trust. And we're seeing that in all sorts of strange places. So like if you ask people how confident are you that you're protected in terms of price, reliability, quality of power in your province, that number's gone up. Not because of anything the sector did, but because of this general decline of populism and rise of deference.
So just along the lines of elections potentially, Trudeau's Liberals are actually doing good in the polls, as most governing parties now across the country. Do you think the federal Liberals will consider calling the election this year? There's been some talk this year, most likely this spring. With the numbers this up, do you think that that's something they should consider, or do you think it's still risky being the environment that their numbers were bumped up in?
Yeah. Well, I think the challenge should be getting into an election and then getting through an election without a new effort, right? So I think that if you are political staff or campaign staff for a party that is in a plausible election scenario, you have to work it out.
Yeah.
But that said, the risk of being seen as opportunistic is huge, right? And you don't want to have a sort of, it's not exactly a David Peterson effect, but being seen to call an unnecessary election because you're in a strong position to do so, and then being punished in the polls as a result of that.
Exactly. So I'm going to tie in sort of three questions here, and it ties into the previous one I did ask about this. It's about what the election issue is, and potentially if COVID-19 can be a ballot box question. Of course, timing of the election will play a factor, but something that stuck out to me in the question is related to this was the top issues right now are healthcare related, and if healthcare is going to be more of a ringing issue for Canadians versus the economy, and sort of to tie along the issues during an election, how long will the public be forgiving or accepting of large federal deficits? And if they're currently still in that state of mind and being accepting of that, or is that all going to shift overnight for us?
No, I think it's very unlikely that the deficit issue is going to rise to be a dominant issue anytime soon. It honestly hasn't ever been, right? If you think about the period in the 90s when the Feds really broke the back on the deficit, the trigger on that was markets, not voters. And I'm not sure a conservative government could have got away with as much as a liberal government was able to get away with, right? It's sort of Nixon goes to China type event. The country is pretty much always in a sort of 2-to-1, government should spend according to its ability to pay versus spend according to needs, where the majority say spend according to need. And that's even increased, right? Because the need is seen as greater right now. This is a once in 100-year event. It's being seen as the same sort of thing as fighting a war. And there are some concerns. It's not that governments have a blank check here. We asked the other day Canadians whether they thought government was wasting a lot of the money they're spending on COVID, most of the money, some of the money, not much. And very few people think that there's very little being wasted. Most people think a considerable amount is likely being wasted. And that will become an issue over time. So it's not the deficits per se, it's the wasteful spending of money that will be the issue. But I think the bigger issue right now is leadership, right? So in a crisis, it's not about policy, to my mind. It's rarely about policy. It's mostly about, do we have the right leader in place to make the tough choices that we need, right? And so that's why the Doug Fords of the world do well in this moment, right? Many people that don't agree with his policies think he's done a great job as a leader. He's been firm, he's been decisive, he doesn't take crap from anyone, right? The President of the United States goes to go after our supply of masks, and he rises to the challenges and fights. And so that idea that he's going to be there fighting for me, fighting for my interest, whatever new and crazy thing emerges, becomes a very powerful thing. And for Trudeau, it's similar, right? So Trudeau has been seen to rise to the occasion. And one of the things that really stands out for virtually every premier in this country, I can't think of one that's not true, is that all of their scores as best premier have spiked. And that, I suspect, when we dig into it further, will be because on attributes like strong leader, competent, capable, they're all going to look good. Where I can see them being vulnerable in the short run is plan, right? So traditionally, one of the best indicators of where a swing voter will go is what party or leader has the best plan for the future. And right now, I think there's a pretty big question of, does anyone have any plan at all? And one of the downsides of having a daily press conference is that it seems like you're making it up as you go along. And that can be a pretty big vulnerability. So, again, right now, you don't hear a lot in these conferences about what this government is doing now that the tide has ebbed, to take stock on what happened in the first wave, to make the changes we need to be ready for the second wave. That's just not a major part of anybody's narrative right now. And that becomes a major vulnerability when the next wave hits. If you're seen as not being ready, you get a buy for not being ready for the first one because nobody in the world was. You do not get a buy the second time.
So just want to jump to another quick question. It's a little not related to what we're just talking about,
Sure.
but I want questions that came in. It's a question on I guess, the sort of breakdown of some of the numbers. So when you presented online banking has risen, a few people might not go back online shopping. Did you notice, and I don't know if you have the data yet on this, of the demographic breakdown? So people who are more senior are the ones who are less are more likely to go into a bank, go into a shop. Younger people are the ones who are going to mostly stick to online banking, online shopping, etc. Or was there not so much of a discrepancy with that data?
Honestly, I'd have to look closer. For sure, there was demographic patterns in the behavior before, where, as you would expect, younger people were more likely to be online. So there wasn't as much room for young people to shift to online. Most of the people who shifted will skew towards older people. So I think what we're seeing here is sort of necessity forcing people that were resistant to online tools to experiencing them. And now that they've had 3 or 4 months of living in a more online world, a number of them saying, this works for me. And it may not be that they love the online experience. It may be because they're afraid of the in-person experience still. And so one of the things I haven't had a chance to analyze yet that we have in this data is that for each of those questions, we ask people, is there something holding you back from going back to your old behavior? And what I'm looking is both for people saying, you know what, I really like this. This is more convenient for me. This is easier. I'm perfectly happy doing it this way, versus people saying, well, you know, I miss shopping, but I'm scared. Yeah. And so that will come out, if I'm lucky, before Canada Day, but if not, then right after Canada Day, we'll put that out on our website, and encourage people to follow that. I'll also, if you follow me on Twitter, you connect in LinkedIn, I'll post it on those channels as well. So one way or the other, you should be able to find it.
I guess COVID-19, this whole pandemic forced people to shift how they behave. I was always skeptical about depositing a check on my phone, whereas my closest branches were closed, so I didn't have an option. So I had to do it. And to your point, now that I've discovered it and how convenient it is, I'm probably not going to go back to just going into a bank just to deposit a check. Right. Really quickly, I know we're over time a little bit, but there's some interesting questions, and obviously all the data you presented was really interesting on the airline sector. So somebody here asked if there's a difference between traveling business versus traveling holiday and vacation. And I guess to tie in that too is, do you see that also having a huge ripple effect on tourism? Does that mean, you know, if you're part of a Toronto tourist attraction site, you're going to try and get more domestic tourists? And what pressures do you think that might put on reopening the Canada-US border so we could have tourists not by plane but by car? Because I remember after September 11th, which was another huge event that affected the airline sector, there was a huge uptake of visitors but by car over planes. So if you could comment, I know that was a 4 or 5 questions in one, but I'll let you.
Well, I'll start with the U.S. border, and I'll simply say that I don't see public demand to reopen the U.S. border. I see actually a lot of fear. And so I think if the government is experiencing pressure to open the border, it is not coming from the public. It would be coming from economic interests and the government themselves looking at, you know, a more objective risk-reward analysis, saying how much money are we losing with this border closed, you know, and how much risk do we take on if we allow that economic stream to reestablish itself. But, you know, if you think about Canada and our balance of trade, right, we lose money on tourism, right? We spend more money out of Canada than we get foreign tourists spending in Canada. And so if we spend any portion of that at home, that could go a long way to mitigating the loss of foreign tourists. It's just that, will Canadians want to go and see the same things that foreign tourists want to see, or will we have a different set of needs? We also have the issue that there's still strict limits on the total size. And so many of the venues that would be open, that would depend on tourist dollars, domestic or foreign, can't open at all because they just can't deal with the crowds. So anyway, that's a long way on that. And the first question was, just quickly remind me.
On the airline sector.
Oh, yeah, fine. Okay, so is it business or is it personal?
Yeah.
What we're seeing is that the people that traveled the most are the ones least likely to return to their old behaviors. So what that suggests to me is that, you know, in my own business, we've changed, right? Like I have clients in the States, and I used to fly down to do presentations, and we're doing the presentations, you know, online, and they're working out pretty well. Will they want to pay for me to fly down to the States anymore in this world? Probably not for the next 2 years. And so I just will not need to fly as much as I used to. And when I think about the people who work for me, I'm very reluctant to ask someone to do something they may feel is risky. And so I will be a lot less likely to ask people on my team to fly than I would have before, if only for internal morale issues than anything else, because I can't be sure who's really secretly afraid of being in that tube with recirculated air, right? Even though the evidence is it's pretty safe. You know, I can't think of any outbreaks in Canada that were due to people catching COVID on a plane. Maybe there were a few, but they weren't the big ones. Yeah. And there was a lot of people that were flying at the beginning of this outbreak. So, you know, anyway, leave it at that.
Well, we're a little bit over time. I want to say thank you. I'm actually going to invite my colleague, Caitlin. She's in Montreal right now, so she's going to join in. She's going to formally thank you, but I do have to say again, this has been very informative. And I know we've had a few questions come in that we weren't able to get to, but feel free to email info@tsa.ca. We'll try and get back to you on that. Or Greg, did you want to share your email address if somebody wants to reach out to you with a follow-up question?
Sure. So it's GLYLE, G Lyle, at Innovative Research, all one word, .ca. And again, shouldn't be too hard to find me on LinkedIn or Twitter if you want to follow our releases as we go forward.
Excellent. Thanks, Greg.
Thank
and
you.
Yes. Over to you, Caitlin.
Thank you so much, Greg. As always, your insights on current trends and public opinions are very much appreciated. The data that you presented on consumer behavior suggests that demand is not destroyed, but it is delayed. So it'll be interesting to see how the supply side of the economy copes with this in the months to come. You also noted that the crisis has proven the value of good leadership, both in government and in the private sector. And whether or not the support boost for some brands, including political parties, is here to stay, is sure to be put to the test down the road. So thanks again for the great research and presentation. And just a quick note to our viewers, there will be a very short survey at the end. We would love to get your feedback.
Thanks, Caitlin.